So our moderator for this panel is Catherine Hazelton. Catherine is the principal consultant for Hazelton Strategies. She works with foundations, nonprofits, and public sector organizations to design programs and implement strategies. In her former role as a senior program officer for the James Irvine Foundation, she helped initiate several key programs, including this one, Future of California Elections. So without Catherine, that wouldn't have happened. All right. Hey, I'm going to ask you to keep it quiet. We're going to start our panel now. Okay. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap 2 times. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. All right, I worked with kids before, so I'm glad that comes in handy with the room.
Thanks, Astrid. It's always so nice to be here, and congratulations on a really big room. I'm so glad to see how many people are excited about elections. All right. Well, we're here in this panel to talk about the Voters' Choice Act, and I know a lot of you are very familiar with it, and we've been talking about it throughout the day. So I'm not going to spend too much time attempting to define it, but for those who might be a little newer, just a very brief summary that the Voters' Choice Act was first implemented in California in 2018 in 5 counties. San Mateo, I'm getting ahead of myself. San Mateo, Nevada, Napa, Madera, and Sacramento. The law I think you could say it pretty much reshaped elections in each of those counties in that now all voters are mailed ballots in those counties automatically. Traditional precinct-based polling places were replaced with vote centers throughout counties at which voters can vote up to 10 days in advance of an election and receive a number of various services. They can vote anywhere in their county that works for them. They can register to vote on site and vote that same day. Receive advanced language accessibility and other accessibility supports, and a number of other advantages for them. And as you may have heard, in 2020, 5 additional counties are joining the Voters' Choice Act: Los Angeles, Orange, Fresno, Santa Clara, and Mariposa. Approximately half of the state's electorate will be voting this way. So we found it really, really important and exciting that a number of preeminent researchers have taken a look at what happened in 2018 to help inform us as we all go into these elections in 2020, understand how half of the state is going to be experiencing their elections in 2020, and help inform how that works in those counties and the others that adopt in the future. Before we get too far into the panel, I just want to take a moment to recognize the pioneers in this room, the leaders in the 5 counties that shifted over to VCA, the advocates and activists and community leaders who helped ensure that it worked and that voters understood how to participate in this kind of election. This was kind of a scary thing. I mean, you guys were bold, you were innovators, and you were, in a lot of ways, making it up as you went along and trying out new strategies. And it worked really well. So I just want to say congratulations, thank you for your boldness, and recognize all of you who took the leap into these elections in 2018. And I see James Schwab right there, the godfather of the VCA in so many ways. James, you may be the boldest of all. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a short intro of our panelists and then let them speak to you about what they've been finding in their research about VCA. So our first panelist today is David Becker. He is Executive Director and founder of the nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. He is And actually, I could probably say this about all of our panelists here. I think we should call this the NPR panel, because you've probably heard all of them on NPR. I think we need to get John Myers back up here so he can join the panel. Maybe he should have been on the NPR panel, since that was his former role. But these folks are the ones that you hear all the time on NPR. You see in all of your newspapers as well. And David is certainly very recognizable in that regard as an elections expert throughout the country. Prior to his current role, he was the director of the elections program at Pew Charitable Trust, where he created and led, among other things, ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. Before that, he was Before that, he was a senior trial attorney in the voting section of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. After David, who is going to be speaking to us about research he did in partnership with the Secretary of State's office, we're going to hear from Eric McGee, who is a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. He focuses there on elections, legislative behavior, political reform, surveys and polling. You have most undoubtedly seen his research all over the place as well, including, most recently, there's been a lot of buzz about his efficiency gap, which he created with relation to redistricting, which has been quite impactful in understanding gerrymandering. Before PPIC, he was an assistant professor of political science at the University of Oregon. But more importantly to me and some of the others in the room, he went to UC Berkeley. Go Bears, as did David. Thank you. Okay, after Eric, we're going to hear from Mindy Romero, who is the founder and director of the California Civic Engagement Project at the University of Southern California. And she's based here in Sacramento for USC. She's a political sociologist who studies patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, particularly among youth and communities of color in the United States. And I think it's really relevant that she's here in Sacramento because one of the critical roles that Mindy plays in this field is to interact regularly with the legislature in helping to inform policymaking with regard to what's happening on the ground with voters and in elections. Mindy is talking today about one research project that she has been working on with VCA, but she is actually leading several VCA research projects, including one in partnership with the County of San Mateo that we're not talking about today, but she is an expert in San Mateo's VCA implementation. So if you have any questions on that, don't hesitate to ask her. And then finally, we're joined by Karthik Ramakrishnan, who's a professor at UC Riverside in the political science department there and the founding director of the Center for Social Innovation. He is very prominently known as the director of the National Asian American Survey and founder of AAPIdata.com, which publishes demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. He has published a number of articles and books, and again, someone we hear quite frequently on our favorite public radio and in the news. Okay, well, we're going to get right to their research and start with David Becker.
Thanks, Catherine. Is there a slide up? Because I can't see it. There we go. Okay, great. Well, thanks to all of you for having me here today, and to you, Astrid, and for Future of California Elections for having me here. I think I've been at every single one of these, and it's always a conference that I look forward to every year. It's great for me to be back home in California. I wanted to just mention something. Catherine was talking about the innovators and reformers in this room, and she's absolutely right. It's a remarkable and huge exercise to change the way Californians vote. And because when you're changing the way Californians vote, you're changing the way Americans vote, because 1 in 10 votes cast in the United States of America comes from this state. And it's really a remarkable thing, and it's truly a testament to all the work that you do. And in particular, I want to mention the election officials who have undertaken a lot of new reforms in the last several years, all with an eye towards improving the voter experience here in California. I think the results have been remarkably successful. So I'm going to share with you some kind of an insight into some of the research that we've conducted in partnership with the Secretary of State's office. The reports will be published shortly. And some of this data you'll see in those, but this is kind of a preview of some of that. And happy to take questions after. Is this the controller? Okay. So first, voter turnout. It's something people talk about a lot. It's obviously a big concern of a lot of people in this room. Now, one of the things, I'm about to show you some slides, one of the things to be aware of is it's very difficult to isolate a particular reason that voter turnout goes up or down because there's so many things that impacts it. It's also very difficult to really get a great sense of the impact on voter turnout in just one election cycle, primary general election cycle. So I just want you to take those caveats. The early returns, and Secretary Badilla mentioned this, are good. Now again, not attributing any particular reason to that, but because there's a variety of things that could have occurred. But as you can see, state turnout in the primary, the dark blue there, state turnout was 29% in the primary and 50% in the general election. This is of eligible voters, and slightly higher in the 4 to 5 percentage points range in VCA counties. Now, comparing the primary turnout, this is just primary elections right now. We're going to be getting the general election in a bit. You can see that across the 5 VCA counties, the difference was good. It was a positive increase in turnout between 2010 and 2018 and 2014 and 2018. I won't go through all these numbers. Statewide, those saw the same thing. And this is, again, the caveat I mentioned with regard to reading too much into the turnout numbers from just this snapshot. But the overall increase in primary election turnout was slightly less, this is the increase, slightly less than what we saw statewide, even though the overall turnout was slightly more. Again, these are very small changes, though. We're talking about less than 1% difference. Okay, now we broke it down by age here. And as you can see, we see, and you'll see this in every graph of turnout, what are you seeing? Smaller bars on the left where you're talking about younger people, larger bars on the right when you're talking about older people, almost a linear relationship there. That is something we're always struggling with in turnout. This is not just in California, it's everywhere. But as you can see, the VCA counties in every age group slightly outpaced the statewide turnout. And interestingly, that was true even in the 18 to 24 and the 65 plus. It was true all across the spectrum. And now for the general, we see the exact same, the bars are a little bit bigger, but the same growing bars as we move to older voters. And again, similar outpacing of turnout in VCA counties compared to statewide by about the same rate, 6% difference in the 18 to 24, 6 percentage point difference in the 65 plus. Okay, this is broken down by ethnicity. This is using the data from the voter registration database, where about 20% of voters have self-identified by ethnicity. Our preliminary research suggests that that's actually surprisingly representative, which is good. But there's some caveats with this. It's because it's not an actual full 100% representative sample. Here you can see turnout, of course, what we've seen in many elections nationwide, not surprisingly, white turnout outpaces turnout of minority groups. With, at least here, the Hispanic turnout being among the lowest. But in every single ethnic category, VCA counties outpaced the statewide turnout. And this is for general. Same thing with although in some cases it was very, very close, as in the multiracial category. But you see, again, white turnout outpacing the rest, but the margins are narrowing in the general election turnout. And there's not as much disparity or deviation between minority groups and white turnout in these elections. Okay, where I think some of the most interesting information that came out of our research was from voting methods, and how people chose to vote given the multitude of choices they had under the Voters' Choice Act. As you know, all voters are receiving a ballot in the mail. They can choose to return it by mail. They can choose to return it by drop box. They can choose to return it to a vote center. They can choose to go to a vote center, get a new ballot, cast it there. And they can do that earlier on Election Day. So first, here's the overall voting methods. As you can see, voters are voting with their feet here, or rather with their tushes and their seats at the kitchen table, because well over 90% are voting by mail, returning their mail ballot. Now, that's not all returning it by mail, but they are returning the ballot that they received in the mail rather than going to the vote center. But still significant percentages, 5 to 9%, are choosing to go to the vote center. Now, this is by ethnicity, and I think this is one of the most interesting graphs I'm going to show you. As you can see, this is not evenly dispersed amongst different racial groups. And in particular, note that blacks and Hispanics are voting in person at about twice the rate of whites. And something very much to keep in mind in communities with large black and Hispanic populations in particular, make sure there are really robust in-person voting options for those people, because they're choosing to vote in person at higher rates than the rest of the electorate. General election, same thing, about twice the rates of voting in person amongst blacks and Hispanics as whites. Next, we're going to get a little more into the detail about the vote-by-mail ballots. Now, this is how those who were returning the vote-by-mail ballots chose to return them. And as you can see, across age groups, it's pretty much even between mail and drop-off locations, with the exception of 65 plus, where you see much higher rates of returning by mail. Probably not very surprising. And then in the general, we're seeing something very different. Oh, no, this is by age, rather. Hold on. Yes, by age. So in the general, more and more people are choosing to drop them off. This is actually consistent with what we've seen in other states that have that do mail balloting, where there's a majority of votes are being dropped off at locations rather than returned by mail. And you're seeing that consistently across every age group, again, with the exception of the 65 plus. Now, lastly, I wanted to talk about rejected ballots. And as I show you this, I want to make sure that you understand there was actually a pretty small number of rejected ballots in the Voters' Choice Act counties. In the primary is about 1.2% of all ballots cast. Remarkably, in the general, that dropped to about 0.9% of ballots cast. It's remarkable because the general election electorate is actually probably slightly lower information than the primary election electorate. And so to see a reduction is actually a really good sign that the counties are getting better at this, the voters are getting better at this, and we're seeing fewer rejected ballots. I'm going to show this to you for a couple minutes, but not a couple minutes, a couple seconds rather. And I expect you all to ingest all of this data immediately. This will be in the report. But you can see the biggest thing to take from this is the ballot not being received on time was the biggest reason for rejected ballots in the general election. About 40% of all the ballots, and then about a quarter of the ballots that were rejected, again, relatively small percentage, were rejected because of non-matching signature.
Can they focus that a bit?
I don't know, can they focus that a bit? But again, the main things, 40% ballot not received on time, 25% about non-matching signature, and about 23% no voter signature. Those are the three main reasons, and by a large margin, the main reasons ballots were rejected. The last thing I'll mention, I don't have a slide for this, I'll keep this up, is we were talking a little bit about the provisionals, and Rebecca from Madera County was talking about the provisionals that she saw. And what Madera County saw was very similar to what the other VCA counties saw, which was that non-CVR provisionals dropped very low. Total in the general election, the 5 VCA counties saw fewer than 400 provisional ballots that were non-CVR. You might know that California has a reputation for generating a lot of provisional ballots. In the 2016 election and 2012 election, for instance, California alone represented half the provisional ballots nationally. So to see reductions like this is really notable. So with that, I'll hand it over to the next panelist.
All righty. So I am not actually on the program. I'm sort of a crasher to this particular party. But it makes me think about when I went to see Chris Rock perform. In the middle of the performance, Dave Chappelle just showed up on stage. And he wasn't on the program. He wasn't even apparently planned before the whole thing started. And suddenly there was Dave Chappelle. And the performance was amazing. And so I think what I'm saying is I'm Dave Chappelle. So, or at least I hope I am. So what are we trying to do here? This is actually with Mindy and also with Thad Kauser at UCSD and Laura Daly, who's also with Mindy's organization. We're also part of, I should just give a shout out quickly to the University of California's Office of the President that funded this research. We're part of kind of a collaborative of people who are doing research on the VCA and other aspects of California's elections called the New Electorate Study. And we are going to really, so David talked about how he didn't want to really get into sort of the causal effect of the reform. Well, we are just going to completely launch ourselves into that breach and see what we can come up with. So we are looking very narrowly at that one specific question. What was the effect of the VCA on turnout in 2018? So, whoop, can you switch the, oh, I have the thing, sorry. Okay, here we go. So there's an obvious quick way of looking at this, which is to just compare the counties that adopted the VCA to the counties that didn't in 2018. I should note, now this is going to sound like a really nerdy point, but it's actually important. I should note that these numbers, all the numbers I'm going to be presenting here, are averages of every county, treating each county as one unit. So the numbers that most people are used to seeing is where you add up the total number of voters in one group and then the total number of voters in another and compare them that way. It's essentially weighted by the population of the county. Now that's a great way of approaching things if you want to understand the total impact that a reform had on the number of voters who were under that reform. But it's actually not a great way of looking at it if you want to understand the causal effect of that reform. So all of our numbers here are averages, and so you should keep that in mind as you're looking at all the graphs and everything. So if you look at those, just as those averages, nonetheless, even with those averages, VCA 36% in the primary, 57% in the general. Then the non-VCAs were 33% in the primary and 52% in the general. So in both cases, the turnout in the rest of the state was lower than the VCA counties. In addition to that, the VCA counties also saw a big increase in turnout in 2018, 10% in the primary and 18% in the general over the last midterm election. But of course, there's a problem with the quick look, a number of problems. One is the long-term turnout patterns of these counties, right? It turns out that in most cases, these counties actually had higher turnout on average over a long period of time. They got to opt into this system. So generally speaking, counties that were sort of had higher turnout in the first place were the ones who opted in. In 2018, turnout was up everywhere in the state. We had a gangbuster year in the state in terms of turnout. So you have to keep that in mind in terms of comparing 2014 to 2018. And then there's a whole bunch of other things that go on in elections that, you know, that are idiosyncratic to that particular election and you might need to take into consideration. So what is our approach? Well, basically, it boils down to looking at how disproportionate was the turnout increase in the VCA counties compared to the rest of the state. So this is basically looking at VCA counties minus the non-VCA counties before the reform in 2014. And the same thing after the reform. You have two differences there. And then you see how much those differences changed. There's actually a fancy term for this. It's called the differences in differences model for obvious reasons. But that's the basic idea. Now, that's a very simple approach to it. We, of course, go, add all the bells and whistles and try to look at it with some statistical models that account for longer-term trends, and as well as these other campaign and election dynamics that I was just mentioning. So here's, just to give you a sense, there's the trends comparing the average of all other counties that didn't adopt the VCA and each of the individual counties. The key to what we're doing here is we're looking at that last little kink in 2014 before the reform to after the reform. So you want to see, if you're having an effect of the VCA, you want to see either the red line converging on the gray line after the reform or actually exceeding it. So it's sort of a higher slope to that line after the reform. That's in the primaries. Here's the generals, same kind of idea. You can see that there's these longer term differences between the counties, right? So what do we get? Well, if you look at the overall share, turnout as a share of eligible, we get an increase of about 3 percentage points in the VCA counties. So we're saying this is likely a causal effect of the reform. In the primary, 3.5%. Oh, am I behind the slides? I'm sorry, it's hard to keep track of them. So there's the general, 3%. And here's the primary, 3.5. So that's just this very simple 2014 to 2018, looking at the difference in the difference, right? Here's the same thing for young voters. So now the numbers that you want to see are down at the bottom there. So 6.8% for the general and 2.6 for the primary. Here's Latinos, 3.8% and 2.3. So consistently a little bit smaller for the primary than for the general. And then finally for Asian American, we do see a reasonably large bump for the general, but not much going on in the primary. So I mentioned we try to account for some of the other factors that could be explaining these results, and that consists of trying to look at longer time trends for the pre-VCA period, and then looking at other idiosyncrasies that might explain what was going on in these counties. One of those idiosyncrasies is competition. So we look at state legislative and congressional races that fall within the boundaries of those counties. If they're competitive, they might boost turnout. And also partisan dynamics. Turns out Democratic counties saw a much bigger increase in turnout in 2018 than did less Democratic counties in California. So the results of all of that is weaker effects in many cases. Because we're accounting for some of the other little things that are going on. But the effects are generally still observable, so we still see generally a positive increase. With varying degrees of confidence, usually those, as the previous graph suggested, the confidence that we have in the effect is weaker for Asian Americans, but generally pretty robust for Latinos and young people and the top line numbers. So overall, we think the Voters' Choice Act increased turnout probably about 3 to 4 percentage points. Sorry. And then the effect for subgroups varied. Sort of a solid 2 to 7%, pretty confident about that for young people. More modest effect of about 2 to 4% for Latinos, and then some effect for Asian Americans in the general election, but not really in the primary. And all those numbers we're not as confident about. We can't say with as much certainty. The one thing I will say, though, is we don't find any evidence here, because there have been concerns about how people might be scared off from voting by this new system, because it's new and different, and they don't understand how it works. We didn't find any evidence anywhere of a negative effect. So varying degrees of confidence about the positive effect we find, but no evidence of any kind of negative effect in any of our numbers. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I'll note that that his full brief, along with Mindy and Thad's full brief, is available out on the resource table. Mindy is coming up next to discuss this brief that she has prepared in partnership with Karthik. And I will also note, if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to start preparing them now on the index cards on your table. Astrid's going around collecting them, and we'll have a little time for questions after Karthik speaks.
Okay, I have to see. No, you really can't see the screen. So, we always knew, Eric, that you were special. I did not know that I was working with the Dave Chappelle of, I suspect, not only VCA researchers, but researchers, period. So, at least I know how to partner. And thank you, because you used that joke. I at least got to use somewhat of a joke, because I usually am hard-pressed to think of something funny. Anyway, where is our clicker? Still trying to get all the attention, huh, Eric? I see how it is. Okay, so my name is Mindy Romero, and I direct the California Civic Engagement Project at USC, housed here in Sacramento. And I'm going to talk to you about another piece of VCA research, specifically looking at the implementation process. And as Catherine said, this is a partnership with the Center for Social Innovation out of UC Riverside, Karthik's center. Our research team, this is going to be a little weird to toggle back and forth. For the CCEP, myself and Laura Daly, who's my lead research associate. Laura over there, thank you very much for all your work on this project. And of course, Karthik, and I'll let Karthik introduce his team as well. So a big team. So why study implementation? So what is the goal of this research? So really what we did is an extensive study. We looked at the 2018 process for the 5 counties that adopted in California. I'll talk about methodology in a moment. And really the goal was to inform the implementation process in 2020 and beyond for those counties that have already decided to adopt in 2020, those counties that may still be deciding or deciding beyond 2020, and certainly for those counties that have already gone through the first election cycle. We hope that the research is also useful for them as they move forward and think how they may be making some adjustments potentially. And you can see. Just briefly on the methodology, just so you know where the research is coming from and also where we're kind of going with this as well. This is the first research brief out on the table, along with the other work that you just heard from. Both are out there and also going to be available online as well. So 40 confidential in-depth interviews with election officials from VCA and non-VCA counties, statewide interviews with statewide advocacy groups, community groups, other stakeholders, basically many key players that were involved in implementation at the county level and also statewide. 6 focus groups, and I'll let Karthik talk about the social media analysis and survey, and of course gathering materials, education and outreach related materials. Okay, so this brief though, the brief that's available to you today and what I'm going to talk about is specifically from the perspective of election officials. So we talked to many people, gathered lots of data, multi-method study, but today's about election officials, their perspective. What can we learn from them? 2 questions are addressed in this brief. I'm just going to talk about the one that's bolded because of time. So we see there's a relationship between how folks define success and then the types of considerations they think that are important when it comes to implementation. But today, which factors should county election officials consider when deciding to adopt the VCA? Please note that a full report, a comprehensive report, will be coming out soon that will cover additional perspectives, of course, from stakeholders, advocacy groups, but also talk about other implementation elements of the implementation process. Okay. So, which factors should county election officials consider when deciding to adopt the VCA? What did the election officials that we spoke with, what did they say? All right. So they provided, and I'm going to go through this very quickly, so happy to jump in the Q&A, so forgive that, but there's a lot to show you, and it's a qualitative, this element is a qualitative study, so it takes a little bit longer to talk through. So the suggestions that they presented were significant, the factors should be, right, considered a significant investment of time and resources, preparation of election operations, collaboration with stakeholders, that's from the beginning, early on, an EAP process through the outreach and education process. And we heard a lot about understanding the voter experience project. If you want a successful implementation process, if you're considering adoption and you want surely for that to be successful in your county, consider all of these elements. And these are kind of pooled into kind of 4 main buckets, if you will. And I'm going to let election officials, their voice, speak today a lot, as I think that that's really helpful to hear directly from their perspective. So as one election official explained, and this is under significant investments in time and resources, I'm just giving you highlights, of course, right? Plan ahead, allocate resources for voter education, allocate resources for vote centers, and allocate resources for technology and the different systems. The human side of the equation and the technological side of the equation are really important in terms of resource allocations. Another election official advised, if they're going into this thinking it will be easier, colleagues, other counties, that it will take less time and cost less money, they are destined to consider this a failure. If they see it as something that is a tremendous amount of work that requires significant time to develop and deploy and implement, and that work is rewarded through increased turnout, a more convenient and accessible process for their customers, then I think it'll be successful. Another election official explained, this is under the category of preparation, right? The importance of preparing your election operations, right? So how you manage the check-in process at a vote center is going to be key to making it a positive experience for the voter. Don't cut yourself short on the number of check-in lines or stations that you would have. So every election official that we spoke with talked about the importance of the level of engagement that's required. Some also talked to us about what that's like, right? The fact, and this particularly we have one quote here that's, that articulates it. What is it like for election officials? Often the level of engagement required by the VCA, we were told, is something that's new, it's not as familiar to election officials. So gaining the skills to do this engagement requires a strong commitment by election officials, one that extends beyond time and resources alone. And one election official noted that colleagues considering implementation need to be open to a much higher level of engagement, particularly around working with their communities, right? Particularly around voter education. So understanding the voter experience, the importance of understanding the voter experience for a successful adoption and implementation, right? Several election officials noted their concern. We heard a lot about long lines in some vote centers on election day or near the end of election day, in both the primary and general. So they cited the importance of improvements. Improvements need to be made to vote center operations. So voters essentially don't get discouraged right after they have discouraged in that voting process, but discouraged in the future as well. Other election officials also, though, noted that it might also be about managing expectations around using vote centers on election day. So helping voters to understand what that process is going to be like, that they may potentially experience lines, and hopefully getting them, from the perspective of those that we spoke with, getting them into the vote centers or getting them through the process earlier, not on election day, and maybe not necessarily even in person, right? CVR. So we heard a lot about CVR, and when in the other discussion, and I'm going a little bit longer today. Karthik and I kind of split our time since I covered the nuts and bolts of the study for both of us, the explanation of the study for both of us. So CVR on election day was cited as one cause of lines, the lines that did occur in some vote centers. To begin to address those long lines, did you know that the CACEO, California Association of Clerks and Election Officials, established a line busting committee? Did you know that? Did you hear about it? No? So there's a line busting committee. And I'll leave it to all of you to learn more about that. As one election official said, if there are lines happening at a vote center, then that's not success. It's for vote center and non-VCA counties to figure out how we can, for that Monday and Tuesday, handle the potentially huge numbers of voters that either want to change their registration or want to newly register to vote. Making sure I'm staying in sync. Okay. Another component that should be considered, we heard, was the location of vote centers, the siting process, certainly, how you cite, right, the required number of vote centers, how those are selected and engagement, right, the process for voters there, and the result of those, where they are located. But also we heard about number. So one election official that hadn't yet adopted, if they do adopt, they said that they're going to try to provide more vote centers than the minimum number required, thinking about the impact for voters, switching from polling places to this new system, right? So they wouldn't be shocked by that impact. Okay. So overall, a key theme was, as I've already mentioned, the voter experience. It was, infused throughout, if you will, all of the discussions that we had with election officials. So essentially, a positive voter experience entails efficient vote center operational logistics, the reduction of long lines, robust outreach efforts for voters to help increase voters' awareness and ensure that they use the services that are available to them, right? They're aware of them and they use them and they go smoothly. And of course, collaborating with community groups was cited as something that was vital. How election officials went about that collaboration, it can vary, right, in the components of that, but just citing it as important, that was recognized. So the study's findings, this element of the study's findings, emphasized the complexity involved in a county's decision of whether to adopt or not, right? Whether it's right for that county and all the considerations that need to be made to be successful in that implementation. How a county or county election officials define successful implementation helps inform that, as I mentioned before. And the importance of the voter experience. Just a little bit here, it's my last slide, but while the VCA we know was designed, we've heard a lot about it today again already, right? So many reforms coming together into one new model, designed to really improve, to provide more choices to voters, more services to voters. It has, though at the same time, as it's being implemented in the way that's being implemented, a potential, and this was recognized by election officials, to potentially inconvenience some voters, such as with lines or just a lack of understanding on how the new system works, how to access it, right? How to navigate it. So a commitment, ultimately, by election officials to invest, this is what we heard from election officials themselves, right? A commitment by election officials to invest in a realistic and sufficient allocation of resources was really critical, right? Through both the administrative component, which we often hear those kinds of conversations, but also the collaborative outreach component to be successful. So it's critical for a positive voter experience. Thank you.
Of this study, and we see this very much as part of this larger whole. And you'll be seeing more of this in the report and other briefs that'll come out from our collaborative work. So what we did with respect to the survey is to focus on community organization perspectives. We have interview data on that, focus group data on that, as well as broader contextual data and expertise that Mindy personally and her team bring to bear in terms of their longstanding engagement in this field. So I'll talk about some of the survey results, but with a sort of caveat. And actually there's two caveats. One is we have these additional pieces of information that we're going to bring to bear, so please see it in that light. And also I can't resist seeing a crowd like this and the kind of engagement here, so I just shook on a deal with Astrid beforehand to see if we can actually get greater engagement on our survey in terms of the attendees of this conference, as well as possibly the greater list that Future of California Elections has. So we're hoping that with the collection of more data, we'll get some final resolutions.
So sign up for the list.
Sign up for the list. So in terms of some of the survey findings, one, when it comes to engagement, both in the law and its implementation and in the intention of a lot of the partners, there was a lot of interest in early engagement on the Voters' Choice Act. What we see from our survey is that there was greater engagement, from what we can tell, from the reports that we've gotten so far, in terms of people engaging right around the time of the primary and between the primary and the general election. Not as much early engagement, say 6 months or earlier before the primary. And this is something that we may want to think about, especially with new counties coming online, and especially given the extremely high-profile nature of the 2020 primary that's going to be upon us very soon. Another major finding was that collaborations were important, but collaborations not only among community organizations, but also a sense of collaboration with election officials. So this wasn't a case of, at least from what we can tell in the survey data, and you can tell us there's additional things we need to dig deeper into, didn't seem as much of a kind of siloed type of engagement when it came to VCA. And then finally, when it comes to whether there was sufficient engagement by counties on engagement with LEP populations and voters with disability, from what we can tell, it looks like a mixed record, but part of that might be either not being aware of all of the actual engagement that was going on, because these are perceptions by community organizations, or maybe expectations not meeting actual deliverables. But again, these are early and preliminary findings, but as we put in these other pieces and hopefully get engagement from a much larger group of folks like yourselves who are engaged in VCA, we'll be able to tell that story in a more authoritative way. Finally, when it comes to the social media analysis, so this is looking, using a machine learning approach in terms of quantitative coding of Twitter accounts known to be involved in VCA-related work. So we scraped content from 75 Twitter accounts, and we looked for tweets like vote centers, drop boxes, et cetera. And we came up with a data set of about 1,400 tweets. And I'll just talk about some of the major findings there. One is that tweets about deadlines and reminders tended to be the most frequent tweets and also the most retweeted and liked. So that's something, it makes sense, but to some extent you can say that those could relate to non-VCA as well, but generally we find that those are very engaging. Provisional ballots, while smaller in size, was the second most retweeted topic and indicating a disproportionate level of retweeting. We're going to do some additional topic modeling. We saw a high level of engagement in tweets involving San Mateo and Sacramento counties, but those are also larger counties with larger populations. So in the future, we're going to try to dig deeper with this approach. Even on this, I'll put in another ask, and we'll have this ask not only for community organizations, but also election officials. We know that Twitter is one piece of the social media landscape, and especially if there were community organizations and election officials and counties that were buying Facebook ads, or even if we can somehow get access to the Twitter analytics that people have within their accounts to look at total impressions and not just likes and retweets, that would be incredibly valuable information. So we hope to work more with you as we round out this social media analysis to portray a more complete picture. Twitter certainly is important, and I'll just end with, when we looked at some of the highly frequented and engaged tweets, some of these folks I think are in the room. Well, I saw Paul Mitchell earlier today. Paul Mitchell had the highest level of engagement on his tweet, but I'll let you go figure out what that tweet is. It was a radical step in terms of views on voter registration. It had 413 retweets and nearly about 1,350 likes. Kim Alexander from the California Voter Foundation had a tweet that was very relevant to VCA that had a high level of engagement. I thought I saw a tweet from Kim earlier today. And then I love this about Twitter. The next highest thing relevant to VCA, and maybe you know who this is, Election Babe. That's a Twitter account that had an extremely high level of engagement on VCA-specific content. So anyway, so some of this stuff is actually fun too, right? It's not just like hard-nosed social science research. So anyway, look forward to the discussion and the continued partnership. Thank you.
All right, we have just a brief bit of time for questions. I'm going to respond to the first one, actually. Someone asked to repeat the 5 counties that implemented VCA in 2018 and those going forward in 2020. The 2018 counties were Nevada, Napa, San Mateo, Sacramento, and Madera. And the counties that to date have signed on for 2020 are Los Angeles, Orange, Mariposa, Fresno, and Santa Clara. It is possible that other counties could join on, and we shall see. All right, a couple of other questions that have come in. First, a question for David Becker, asking if you could, if it's necessary to disaggregate at all any of the ballots, the vote by mail ballots, if they were returned at vote centers. I think you said 5 to 9% were returned, or voters participated in vote centers, but does that include vote by mail?
Yeah, so the way we used it for the slides here, it was just the vote center votes were the people who went to the vote center, got a ballot at the vote center, and voted that ballot that they received at the vote center. So we kind of divided up by which ballot did someone vote? Did they receive it at a vote center? Or did they receive it in the mail? And then secondarily, where was that ballot cast? Was it cast at a drop box at a vote center, or was it sent in the mail? And there's some other variations there. But for these slides, all of the ballots, the mail ballots that were dropped off, we combined them all for these slides, but in the report, it will be broken down by where they were dropped off, whether it was a drop box or a vote center, for instance.
Great, thank you. Let's see, so there are a few different questions about sites, and one noted if certain groups, demographic groups of voters vote more or less in person compared to vote by mail, is there a possibility of lawsuits against counties depending on where they place vote centers?
I guess I'll take that. So, well, there's always possibility of lawsuits. It doesn't mean you're going to win. But certainly you need to be attentive to where vote centers are. I think the legislation already is attentive to that, which is very helpful. I know the counties who place vote centers were working with their communities as they're required to determine the best place, and I think they did a pretty good job. And I think we'll learn more about that over time. Of course, this is why the Voters' Choice Act is so important. It actually gives more choices for people who have differing preferences for how to vote than most other states offer, where, for instance, up until recently in New York, you had to physically show up at a polling place, one and only one polling place within a 15-hour period of time. Voters in California can choose a variety of different options, and while there are some options that appeal to more voters and there are some demographic differences there, as long as the opportunity is equal, then everyone reaps the benefits.
Great. Another vote center question is specific for Mindy, who, with partners, developed a citing tool to help counties determine where vote centers should be. This question is if that citing tool will be used to make recommendations for all California counties, and also a question of whether any of the 5 counties who adopted VCA used your recommended sites.
Okay. I guess I'll take the second question first. Our understanding is that all of the counties, certainly we worked with all of the counties as well as stakeholders in the development of the vote center citing tool. And if you don't know what that is, because I know we were short on time, you can go to our website, CCEP website, and explore it. So we worked with all of the counties who were great to work with and all the stakeholders to design and develop it. And my understanding is that all the counties used it to some degree, I think to varying degrees, in terms of whether they specifically took, if you will, a recommendation from the citing tool. I don't know if I can say that definitively, because there's so many factors. We presented the data to inform conversations, both within election offices and with election offices with communities, and always noted that there are probably many other things besides the data that went into our tool, which is based off of the 14 criteria in the SB 450 bill around citing. Many different elements that impact citing, and so the data was to help inform those conversations, and our understanding is that it did to varying degrees, and we are also working on updating and expanding the vote center citing tool. So. That was probably enough of an answer because of time.
Yes, that's right. And I want to thank everyone for their questions. There are unfortunately more questions than we're going to be able to get to here, including the one that is addressed to Chappelle.
Forever he will be known now.
So were vote centers well used during the period of up to 10 days before Election Day?
So we've got some pretty good data on that. There is a very significant increase in usage of vote centers as you get closer to the election, and very, very low usage as you get farther out. So as you're in the 10-day period, the beginning of vote centers being open, very, very modest usage of the vote centers. Once you're getting in the last few days before election, you're seeing very significant usage of vote centers. And we'll have data on that in the report, by the way.
Great. Anyone else on that? Okay. Let's see. So with 2 minutes remaining, another data question. Were the increases in turnout among existing permanent vote-by-mail voters or new vote-by-mail voters? Was there a difference?
So I don't know the rates offhand. We did look at the permanent vote-by-mail voters and how, whether they were more likely to vote by mail or not. And we saw, as you would expect, the permanent vote-by-mail voters were more likely to vote by mail than the rest of the electorate. I think we're going to probably see that even out over time, but certainly they have a familiarity with it.
Great. Have any of you in your research compared the VCA and non-VCA counties regionally, or thought of them in by other factors that might define them, like whether they're rural or not, and whether there's if there's anything that you could say about how a rural county might do, how a larger county might do, how a Bay Area county might do, et cetera? Are there other ways, any immediate observations that pop out with those first 5 counties?
Hello? Okay. Just one thought about that is we wanted to be careful about making too much out of the differences between the individual counties that adopted the VCA in the first time around, because it is one election or two elections. And 5 counties, and there's all kinds of, again, as I said in my presentation, there's all kinds of idiosyncrasies. We tried to account for as many as we could, but there might still be some. So we don't want to make too much out of those differences. Nonetheless, in some of our models, we controlled for the total population of the county, and it didn't really change any of the results. So that's one thing that isn't maybe so much of a factor. So.
And I'll just say in the report, we do break down as much of the data as we can by county so people can look at them. Obviously, San Mateo and Nevada counties are very different in character, and that should certainly be taken into consideration as you're looking through the data, because there are variations between the county. And it's actually a really good question, because the rural-urban difference is going to be a significant one. Age differences are going to be significant. Diversity is going to be significant, racial and ethnic diversity. So there's a variety of things, and hopefully people will be able to review the data and reach their own conclusions based on the characteristics of the county.
Great. I'll ask just one more question.
May I add just for the VCA implementation study, one of our research questions is looking again at the process and how that developed. It is by geography and by type of county and many characteristics involving the county, or counties.
Great. So did your research, any of your projects, reveal any unanswered questions or areas of further inquiry that either you would like to look into or that you would suggest other counties or researchers look into as we head into 2020? Karthik.
Go ahead.
Reprise some of what I'd said is, I think, especially, I mean, it's interesting. I don't want to say that truth is subjective, but there are parts of truths that are subjective, and perceptions matter, right? So especially when you're talking about process, I think it's important to not only get a sense of what actually occurred on the ground, but what different people's perceptions were, because that can be so critical in the future in terms of legitimacy, but also just level of awareness on many of these things. So that's where, I mean, it gets messy sometimes. I mean, it's, and Mindy and I mean, we've done quantitative research, and it's like, it's nice to see those nice graphs with those like crisp findings. But with a lot of this work, especially as it involves process, but also politics and expectations, and either met expectations, exceeded or not, it is messy, but we shouldn't shy away from the messiness in that research.
I would also say, just from the lens of the study that I was a part of for voter turnout, like there are basically two different mechanisms that you can imagine, maybe three that could be affecting the way that people are engaging with turnout and why they might turn out at higher rates. And one of them is conditional voter registration. Another is the availability of the vote centers being close to where they are. And then another is that they get a vote by mail ballot, right? So trying to tease out those different potential causes of any increase that we see would be a really interesting thing to look at. And it's not something we looked at in our report.
And I'll just jump in. One thing regarding the work that Eric was just describing, also outreach, right? We've talked about just the level of outreach in each of these counties and how that could impact turnout. And I think the thing to keep in mind with all of this work is that this is, as we've all said, this is the first election cycle. This work, I think, research on the VCA, as is the case with other election reforms too, but I think particularly with this one, is so critical, right, to get that early first look. And we all understand the caveats that are involved. We're going to learn from this research methodologically, how to conduct appropriate social media analysis, right, and tools, and develop tools to be able to do that. But it's important to get, especially because counties are considering adopting, counties are adjusting as they go forward, to be able to get the research with that, but with those caveats, I think is really important. And I just want to emphasize to all of you, you're looking at really that we know of, the bulk of the research around VCA right now, this panel here. And I think this panel is so important because I'm hoping that it's helpful for all of you to see the work, to hear about the work. As you leave here today, you can pick up copies when David releases his report for the Secretary of State's office. I'm sure that'll get in the hands of everybody here. But you now at least know that there is more to look, right? More to look at, more information on all of these reports, more reports to be coming out from all of these studies. David, you have the general election report, right? So think of that as those are resources for you, and we'll try to stay in communication, right, with everybody here as we develop that research. And we hope that others come along, at least I hope that others come along, and build on our work in terms of creating additional certainty, right, in some of our analysis, maybe challenging some of the analysis, but also methodologically with some of the data challenges that we've seen around just getting data on the VCA, particularly from the voter file, in terms of different ways that we want to measure it. Hopefully that also helps. We learn from that going forward and can inform the types of data that are available for other researchers.
I just want to add one of the things that I'd like to see researched a lot more is more research on when people choose to return their ballots. Napa County reported their voters are very attuned to mail voting, and one of the unintended consequences of that is they're returning their ballots later and later because they're more and more comfortable with it. And so that obviously has some consequences, particularly for election administrators. As the last panel indicated, the later you get a ballot in, the later you're going to count it. And process it in a variety of other ways. So that research is really important. I also just want to quickly add, I have to catch a flight back to DC, but my colleague Jacob Kipp, who really led all of this research, is back there. Wave your hand, Jacob. And he'll be here tomorrow as well. So please go up to Jacob and ask him any questions. He probably knows this stuff. Well, he definitely knows this stuff better than I do.
I probably should mention one other quick thing. The voter's experience. So I mentioned it in a presentation today, but that's from the perspective of election officials. More research directly, right, with voters on how they're experiencing the VCA is really important. We've done some of that in our San Mateo work, and we're excited to get that out. We did surveys, exit surveys with voters, but I think it's difficult to do that kind of work when you have 5 counties, but now we're going to have 10 counties to do that kind of research. But I think it's really important to understand from the voters' perspective what the VCA, how the VCA is impacting them in a myriad of ways.
Thank you all so much for sharing all of this information with us. And it sounds like we've all got a lot more to learn, both from reading your briefs and from the future briefs to come. And I'll just repeat Karthik's call for engagement. He'll be sending out a link to that survey. And it sounds like he also would like to hear from counties and others on your social media experiences too. So please do feel free to reach out. Lovely to spend the morning with you all. And I hope you enjoy your lunch.